what we're going to do today is we're going to look at one final thing from what Swedenborg talked about with Paul, which we got to talk a little bit about the last time. And then I'm going to try to do my best. Remember the thing I said previously about not being particularly gifted at ending things, but I'll try to wrap up the entirety of what we've been working on. That way, and encourage some further roads to reflection. That way, many of you can think about it as well. But so Spiritual Diary 44:12. Concerning Paul, and Paul is amongst the worst of the apostles, a fact made known through much experience. The love of self with which he had been ensnared before he preached the gospel remained with him even afterwards. And because he was then almost in the same state, being stirred by that love and by his nature, so that he desired to be among the crowds, he did all things with the end in view that he might be the greatest in heaven and judge the 12 tribes of Israel. That he afterwards remained such is established from much experience, for I have spoken with him more than with others, and we talked a little bit about that last time. Indeed, such is he that the other apostles in the other life have rejected him from their company, nor do they any longer acknowledge him as one of them. Also because he had joined himself with one of the worst devils, who wills to rule over all things, and pledged himself to him that he would obtain this. Besides, many other matters which it would be too prolix to relate. All the things I know about Paul, if they were written down, would fill volumes. That he wrote epistles does not testify to his being other than such, for even the impious can preach well and write letters. To be is one thing, and to speak and write another, which was also said to him. Moreover, in his epistles, he has not so much as mentioned a single word of what the Lord taught, nor a single one of his parables. Thus he took nothing from the Lord's life and speech, which was also said to him, although in the evangelist there is the gospel itself. What I want to do, and going back to this particular passage, the one that we did read, um, and I think that the last time we were together, the thing that sort of came out that was most dramatic was this claim that although he was considered to be the greatest of the apostles, he was actually, in Swedenborg's revelation, shown to be one of the worst. And that we find actually this quite dramatic statement. And there are a couple of reasons amongst these, and I just want to draw them to the to the top. That way we can talk about what this implies in Swedenborg's understanding. So this idea that he was going to be the judge of the 12 tribes of Israel, very important point. That he was rejected by the other apostles, which is an interesting point, and that they no longer acknowledged him. And that's an interesting point because that implies that at some point they accepted him. We are told that there are too many things for Swedenborg to write down. And this is a very, very significant claim considering how much Swedenborg wrote. Swedenborg did write volumes and volumes. So this choice to say that if he were going to write that, it would not end essentially, is a very, very, very interesting point. And the final one, or the final two rather, is that we find that Swedenborg already makes this incredibly insightful point that to say one thing, to say the right things is very far from being the right person. And that's an incredibly, well, it's one that we all know. And Jesus said, Many shall call unto me in the last days and say, Lord, Lord. And I will say, Depart from me, for I have never known you. There is this tendency in the gospel already to judge the spirits and not to be convinced just by the words, but solely by actions. And then we find this last line. So thus he took nothing from the Lord's life and speech, which was also said to him, although in the evangelists there is the gospel itself. Now, what Swedenborg is doing here, and I've sort of wrestled going back and forth in trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to say about this passage, because when we went over it the last time, it felt like there was a great deal of stuff that was passed over. And looking at it, I had an entirely different outlook for what I was going to do today, but I could not move away from this particular passage. And I think that here is the reason why. That Swedenborg provides these critiques of Paul, but these are also not unlike the Church of the World that Swedenborg critiques. That in many ways, the failures that we find in the church itself have their origins in some of these same types of mistakes that Paul is making. We start with what he said when he said that he might be the greatest in heaven and judge the 12 tribes of Israel. One of the most interesting components of Swedenborgian theology, and in my opinion, the thing that makes it seem so true, at least for me, my own personal testimony to this, is that the capacity to judge is it's so innately dangerous because it's a slippery slope when you put yourself looking at the lives of someone else and to give yourself a moral opinion about that. And we find this throughout the letters of Paul. He's continuously looking back and he is writing as someone who is in a position of authority, looking to those in the churches, and he is calling condemnation upon various actions, various decisions, what he's interpreting as correct moral behavior, and at many points you can see this personal edge to these things, where it does become not only a question about how one should act before God, but it very much also becomes a question about whether or not you should act as he directs. And this is um, there is a great observation about human nature in this. And that's the first thing I wanted to talk about what Swedenborg is saying. Because if we accept what Swedenborg says, judgment is not something that it's not a clinical judgment. It's not someone going back and looking at you and saying something like, okay, you did X, Y, and Z wrong, so you're going to have this final destination. It's something much more subtle. And the Lord, who has the greatest compassion and does not wish any harm upon human beings, judgment takes on a different sort of value when it's put in that relationship. And I think that the first thing that Swedenborg is warning is against that feeling that one is in powered over others. So he's bringing that at the very beginning, that he talks about he wanted to be the greatest and he wanted to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. And in a similar fashion, when we consider what, the traditional notion of Satan falling from heaven, this is a similar story. Pride, domination, etc. And this is really interesting because we're going to continue that. So, as we see, Swedenborg is talking here that the other apostles in the other life have rejected him from their company, nor do they any longer acknowledge him as one of them. And so I just want to compare that with the very last line. So, although in the evangelists there is the gospel itself, we have repeatedly throughout this course discussed that fact, that I often have used this image that Paul is sort of a commentary upon the Gospels that was elevated to the same level as the Gospels themselves. And in this same passage, we're finding a similar complaint that Paul has gone beyond the level of the Gospels. And I think that this is exactly what he's speaking about in talking about Paul's end to become the greatest in heaven and given the right to judge the 12 tribes. That this kind of personal self-engrandeur pushes you outside of the gospel message automatically. And we see this in the sort of, in Paul's insistence that if you have any other gospel than that which I give you, call it out. This personal stake, his continuing hammering upon the fact that he was an apostle called not by men, but of God. So this is something that completely changes, what the nature of the gospel is. And this is so interesting because if this passage is to be believed or to be taken seriously and literally, what I think is it's showing, and again, it's, I don't quite know where I'm going with this in the terms of the level at this, but there is this sort of moment in which the Christian church, under the leadership of Paul, pushes itself outside the levels at which the gospel themselves function. And Paul's attempts to make things rational and comprehensible and philosophically comprehensible are often at the expense of some of the spiritual vitality that we find in the gospel stories themselves. Um, we mentioned this last time that, Paul does quote from what Jesus says, but I think that what Swedenborg is also saying in pointing out that in the epistles of Paul, we do not have a word what the Lord said. We do not have his parables. We do not have his essence almost, is another critique about what the letters do. That they, in many ways, take the gospel, condense it, and go much further beyond it. And it's also interesting that he is connecting this quite directly with a demonic entity, because he's joined himself with one of the worst devils who wills to rule over all things, and pledged himself to him that he would obtain this. The same sort of personal aggrandizement that has an end that is again a point of domination, a point of judgment, a point in which a human being is standing in the place of the divine humanity. And that's a really, really dangerous place to be, from what Swedenborg has said here. And this is the point where I'm going to try to tie everything that we have talked about so far together. The warnings that we find here, I think, are also warnings for the entire development of the Christian church. We've discussed time and time again in this over the course of our many weeks together that many of the most foundational objections from many people, coming from later times in the development of liberal theology, this is an issue primarily with the way that Paul himself approaches the gospel. When we ended the last course, the question was, how does Swedenborg's writings help us to strip away some of this Pauline understanding of the gospel stories themselves and allow us a new level of experience, a new level in which, instead of relying on the theological acumen of Paul, we are once again forced with that question, and who do you say that I am? Being the incarnated Lord. And who do you say that I am? We have to answer that question for ourselves in ways that are not dependent upon the story of another. And as I was thinking about this earlier, so I had this idea. I was like, well, I could go, and I was going to try to go through each one of the points that we talked about, and I had this entire historical thing, and I was going to be like, okay, well, that's what we're going to do. And then it just clicked to me that focusing in on the main reason that we started this study, and to answer that same question that has driven the entire course of the seminar, why is Paul speaking for the Lord? And we see in this particular formulation that Swedenborg gives us is because it is his own being Paul. He uses his intellectual capabilities and his mindset to stand much higher than he ought to. And in many ways, his voice becomes confused for the voice of the Lord itself. As we mentioned also in the last take, and I tried to be as direct about this as possible, many of the people who have embraced sort of this Pauline logic, particularly in regard to sexual norms or etc., in terms of gay rights and women's rights, they're struggling against an image of God that is specifically taken from one individual and the tradition that came up from him, one individual's attempt to answer these questions in comprehensible terms for the time of his day. And he wrote with such authority that he was canonized by the church. That became the foundational canonical documents in which all other theology became grounded. And then, in a very real sense, this radical transformative message of the Gospels was sealed off behind a wall of Paul's own making. To revisit what Swedenborg says, that they reject him from their company. And in many ways, I thought, well, that question, why is Paul speaking? That's not the question we should have had. But the real question is, how can we get through Paul back to the living reality of the gospel? And I think that's a much more subtle question. And it's a much more difficult question. And we brought this up last week, and I still don't think that I precisely have an answer. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion at the end of this. But how do we reclaim the spiritual vitality of the Gospels from a Christian tradition that is so thoroughly saturated with Paul that, it becomes difficult to say what's what. And this is even made more complicated by the fact that there is evidence that some of Paul's writings actually impacted the gospel structure itself. Now, for many other traditions, particularly those in the Protestant tradition that overemphasize the absolute infallibility of Scripture, the Swedenborgian tradition and what Swedenborg says, it's actually, I think it gives us a different way of looking at this. Because the word, the spiritual vitality behind the biblical passages that we find, that's existing. It has a universal application, but it's not inherently dependent upon the words themselves. And where I was thinking about that earlier today, and in many ways this is a very informal sort of session than what we've done. To try to answer that question, I thought in this very real way, it completely recenters that how we respond to Jesus directly, how we ourselves answer the question of the Lord. And that if you strip apart the Pauline theology and you're re-engaged in the heart of the gospel message itself, these questions are not side questions, but they are fundamental to one's own development. And it's amazing in which Swedenborg was talking about the levels in which people engage the scriptures. And I think this is the conclusion that I came to, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. So, take it with a grain of salt. But that in many ways, what Swedenborg's own process was doing, when he was getting these spiritual revelations and he was going back to the biblical texts themselves, he was participating in this stripping away process. And that gave him incredible insights about the nature of the word itself and how the Lord's message functions on several levels of intersecting living realities. And that as we go through this process of trying to answer those hard questions about what are you trying to say, meaning in the Pauline construction of Scripture, um, as we go through that process and we allow ourselves to be part of that deconstructing process, this is again a a sort of what am I trying to say? You're sort of thrown head first into Swedenborg's own process of looking at the Bible. And that many of the insights that I think he brings up came from his destruction or his stripping away, his engagement with the thought of Paul, his working through the theology, but not solely rationally, but also with the aid of supernatural experiences that brought him to a point in which he was able not only to talk about what the nature of the word was itself, but what the word was not. And this is sort of again, a sort of strange place to go here. And I didn't write any of this down. I mean, my notes are about very different things. But as I was thinking through all of these things, and these half thoughts that you sort of get when you're really excited about something, I thought, yeah, Paul, or the most important thing about Swedenborg's Paul was that it taught him how to engage the biblical text in an attempt not to find just truth, but the truth. And that is what I think that many of us are, or that is what I've tried to inspire. That's what I think a lot of hermeneutics, that's the main goal of hermeneutics, that we are able to give appropriate answers from the text that we are given in deep, engaged, and meaningful ways, and that we do not idealize or idolize a text itself, but seek always to move behind it, to move within it. And that's not an easy thing. In fact, if you look at the Society of Biblical Literature, all these other books, there is an unending, industry of books about interpreting the Bible, hermeneutical accounts, numerous different journal articles, etc., about how do you get to a proper understanding of a text that's so old and yet so vital. And as we have been looking at Paul, we have learned that anytime you accept at face value a scriptural text, you are setting yourself up. One, you are sort of checking your mind away and trying to put yourself into a box in which all of these things make sense without focusing upon the incongruencies, the points at which you see how the text itself is serving rhetorical purposes that are, that are very historically conditioned. And that what I've tried to do is that each one of these sort of depictions of Paul that we've had, when we've talked about Paul depicting himself as a Pharisee, when we've talked about the apocalyptic and the Western Judaic traditions, when we've talked about Paul in regards to the interpretations of the movements that we would call Gnostic, each one of these movements engaged Paul, but fundamentally from this wrong perspective, that in his words are the keys to the primacy of the gospel, when in reality, as we see with Swedenborg, he switches all of that around. And although Paul's thought is incredibly philosophical and it has made, much of Western theology possible, in many ways, it is fundamentally different from the kind of experience and the kind of revelation that we find in the gospel itself. Now, saying all of that, which to be honest, I'm still working through. This is the great benefit of having, places like this where you can think together with others to try to figure out exactly what are you trying to say. And even at the end of these weeks, I thought I had a very clear idea about where the seminar was going to go. And I think for the most part it did. But some of the conclusions that I thought would be so evident at the beginning are not. And I think that what is in fact more beneficial not only for people who are interested in further engaging critical studies of the Bible, but also engaging with critical understanding of Swedenborg himself, is that it's already there provided in sort of the text that Swedenborg gives us. That you are to always seek for the deepest level of the scriptures and to acknowledge, even more importantly, what counts as the word and what doesn't. And he gives us, I think, a very basic overview in his description of the books with the inspired word of God within them. However, what's really, really interesting when you look at the writings themselves is how often he uses Paul as a sounding board to show what is not correct, to then go by and offer a corrective vision of the gospel accounts. So in some ways, if it is true in the last week where I almost depicted Swedenborg as a new Paul, as someone who was likewise experiencing the revelations of God between 1744 and 1745, in this case, he is also Paul's greatest critic, because it is through, I think, really his engagement with breaking down Paul's writings that he comes to understand the complexities of the scripture. And as we are told, um, well, it's several points. You know, his scientific background, all of these things that he was doing in terms of worldly wisdom, in terms of, you know, scientific analysis, rational comprehension, all of those had the goal at the end of helping us re-engage the spiritual vitality of a message that is all too easy to fall away. And this is what Swedenborg talks about. You know, this is why the Lord had to come into the earth in the first place, because keeping the vitality of divine expression alive, keeping your awareness of that alive is incredibly difficult. It can be eaten up by, you know, our experiences by these people speaking for God, notably Paul. But now we have the tools to fight back against that. Nunc licet. Now it is permitted that the former ways that we engage the Christian tradition are no longer going to work, and that there is a new level of personal responsibility where it recenters what you will say. How will you engage with the word that you're finding? And Swedenborg, you know, he is the greatest, in my opinion, way shower about how to do that, but that does not at any point remove us from that responsibility. That we are now into that position. And in some ways, it's much more terrifying, I think, than to accept fundamentally what Paul said. If you believe, you know, Paul had the correct interpretation and that, you know, the gaps in the gospel he fills, that also removes you from having to answer for that. It removes you from having to engage and to think seriously and critically and to think about how things are impacting and driving your spiritual life. And I think that as I'm ending this series, and I hope that we'll do it again, you know, I mean, that's the great thing about having a resource like the Swedenborg Library is that, you know, we don't have the same kind of limits that a school will. We can do this again. We can do this with the same text again, and I promise you we'll come to different conclusions. I would say that, but I really think it would be kind of difficult for me to get around this particular idea that Paul helps us to rethink the scriptures themselves and to, you know, and by breaking down his ideas, we are put again into a choice of actually getting to interact with the Lord in a new way and a powerful way, and hopefully in a transformative way. Now, I realize that that really I hope that you take that in the spirit in which it was given. Um, because it is quite it's raw, it's more raw than other things that I've said, but I tried to be very honest. And when I was thinking, what is the point of all of this? I think that's it. But let's just go over very quickly, well, not quickly necessarily, but we've talked about all of these different visions of Paul, right? We've gone through, his entire engagement with the different traditions. We've talked about all of these different influences that are present. We've talked about the domination of the church. We've talked about all of these sort of very picky historical situations, the context of specific geographical places, time, legal issues, etc., divination, how people came to conclusions about God's voice. And I think that all of that together, again, I think it gives us many more tools to help sift through sort of the chaff to find the wheat behind it. And I also understand how, and this was brought up by one of the people who attended one session and never, and I don't think attended another one, but they said that they were uncomfortable at the level of which we're taking the scriptures apart. Um, that this seemed uncomfortable to them. And they, of course, were not Swedenborgian. But the response was very interesting to me because I thought, yes, this is I think the reason that Paul became so successful is he does a very good job of explaining things for you. And the moment that you start getting through that, and the moment that you start questioning those things, for many people, it's an experience that they don't want to have. But as I'm sure all of us who have attended all of them, and we've thought through these things in different ways, it is something that I think is of the utmost value. Not fundamentally because I think it teaches you how to read text, although it does, not because I think it teaches you to have a greater awareness that all biblical texts are also historical texts, but I think it also has a profound benefit for your own spirit on the reasons that I've already said.